The bar was quiet that night, except for the low hum of conversation and the faint clinking of glass against wood. Thomas Lancaster wiped down the counter with practiced ease, his hands moving out of habit more than necessity. His bar, Lancaster's Refuge, had seen better days, but it had also seen much worse. The establishment sat tucked into a forgotten corner of Epsilon Prime, a city that thrived on corruption, trade, and the silent exchange of secrets. It was a place where status did not matter, where men and aliens alike drowned their regrets in bitter liquor and unspoken deals. Thomas preferred it that way. He was not an old man, but years of running from a past he no longer spoke of had carved deep lines into his face. His shoulders were broad, but they carried an invisible weight heavier than any bouncer he had ever hired. He moved deliberately, slowly, as if making peace with the silence before another long night. Then the door slid open. 3 figures stepped inside, bringing with them a quiet chill that had nothing to do with the climate control. Velker and enforcers. They moved with the precision of men, or things, who had done this before. Their dark, segmented armor absorbed the dim neon glow of the bar, making them look like shifting shadows. The tallest of them, standing at the center, scanned the room with piercing, pupil-less eyes. A villain's gaze could unnerve even the most seasoned criminals. It was the gaze of a predator that had already decided the outcome before making the kill. Thomas barely reacted, finishing his wipe down of the counter before setting the rag aside. He had dealt with all sorts of dangerous men before, but these weren't just mercenaries looking for a drink. They weren't here to make a deal or shake someone down. No, they had walked in with a purpose, and that meant trouble. The enforcers didn't sit. They didn't order. They didn't pretend to blend in. Instead, the leader stepped forward, his heavy boots pressing into the creaky floorboards with deliberate weight. The patrons nearest to the door stiffened, some murmuring excuses before slipping out. The few who remained avoided eye contact as if their own lives depended on pretending this wasn't happening. Thomas folded his arms across his chest, keeping his expression neutral. "If you're here for drinks, you're in the wrong bar." The lead enforcer's mouth curved into something that might have been a smirk if Velan were capable of genuine amusement. "Thomas Lancaster." The way he said it wasn't a question. It was confirmation. Thomas exhaled slowly. "You should have seen this coming." He had been careful, but in a place like Epsilon Prime, secrets only stayed buried if no one cared to dig them up. Apparently, someone had started digging. "I don't know you," Thomas said evenly, but his fingers tensed against the edge of the counter. "No," the enforcer admitted, "but I know you." He took a slow step closer, tilting his head slightly as if studying an old relic. "You were a ghost, a name only whispered in dark corridors, and now here you are, playing bartender." Thomas felt the familiar pull of his old instincts, the ones that whispered that a man like him should always be watching the exits. He kept his expression carefully composed. "A man's allowed to change." The enforcer's smile widened, and this time it was unmistakably cruel. "Not when the past comes knocking." The moment shattered. The first shot was nearly silent, but its impact was deafening. A plasma round slammed into the counter just inches from where Thomas had been standing, sending shards of burning wood into the air. Before he could react, a second enforcer moved faster than he should have, vaulting the bar with unnatural speed. Thomas barely had time to twist aside before a heavy fist cracked against the space where his head had been. The bar exploded into chaos. Patrons dove for cover as more shots rang out, the neon signs flickering under the sudden assault. Thomas stumbled back, his mind shifting gears. He was no stranger to a fight, but this wasn't a simple bar brawl. This was an execution. Another enforcer lunged, this one wielding a blade that gleamed in the dim light. Thomas ducked, grabbing the nearest bottle from the shelf and smashing it against the attacker's arm. The alien hissed but didn't falter. These weren't common thugs. They were trained killers, and they were here for him. Pain erupted in his shoulder as a white-hot plasma shot seared through his jacket, sending him staggering. He barely had time to register the wound before a brutal fist drove into his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. The force sent him sprawling against the counter, his vision blurring for a moment. They were toying with him. The leader crouched beside him, grabbing a fistful of Thomas's shirt and yanking him upright. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Lancaster," he murmured. "You have something that belongs to us." Thomas gritted his teeth, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "I have no idea what you're talking about." The leader chuckled. "You will." Before Thomas could react, a syringe was jabbed into his neck. The drug hit his system almost instantly, turning the world into a distorted haze. His body sagged as darkness threatened to swallow him whole. But before he lost consciousness, he managed to do one last thing. With the last of his strength, he pressed his thumb against the underside of the bar, activating the distress beacon, a silent signal, encrypted and untraceable, sent directly to the only person in the galaxy who might care, his son. Nathan Lancaster was already awake when the alert flashed across his wrist. Calm, he lay motionless in the dark, staring at the glowing red indicator on his screen. It wasn't a general alert. It wasn't military distress. It was something much more specific, his father's emergency signal. Nathan sat up, the sheets falling away from his bare torso, revealing a physique carved from years of brutal training. His fingers hovered over the device as he stared at the blinking light. He hadn't spoken to his father in years, not since the last time they had seen each other, not since the argument that had left something irreparable between them. He had never expected to hear from him again, certainly not like this. He exhaled sharply, shaking off the moment of hesitation. He wasn't the sentimental type. His instincts overrode everything else. If his father was calling for help, it wasn't a request, it was life or death. Nathan moved quickly. In the span of minutes, he was dressed. His combat gear slipped on with the ease of routine. He grabbed his weapons, holstered a sidearm, and checked the charge on his pulse rifle. His mind was already calculating the fastest way to Epsilon Prime. By the time he stepped out of his quarters aboard the UNF battleship Orion's Wrath, his expression was unreadable, cold, determined. He had been trained to eliminate threats, to track enemies, to move unseen. His superiors had called him ruthless, methodical, efficient. Now those very skills would be used for something far more personal. Someone had made the mistake of taking Thomas Lancaster. Nathan was going to make them regret it. Nathan Lancaster moved through Epsilon Prime's underbelly like a shadow, unseen yet utterly aware of his surroundings. The city was a seething mass of corruption and whispered betrayals, its streets pulsing with neon lights that barely masked the darkness beneath. He had landed under the cover of night, slipping past customs with a falsified ID and a well-placed bribe. His mission was singular: find his father before it was too late. He kept his steps measured. Nathan's posture was loose yet ready. The bar where his father had been taken was already cleared out, with nothing left but the charred remnants of plasma fire. Whoever had taken him had not been subtle. They wanted to send a message. Nathan had seen their kind before, enforcers who operated with surgical brutality. His mind sorted through possibilities, cataloging patterns from past missions. Cryon Syndicate, the name fit. A powerful cartel of arms dealers, assassins, and black market traders known for making problems disappear. His father wasn't just a problem, he was an opportunity. Nathan ducked into a narrow alley, scanning for signs of movement. His contact was late. That wasn't a good sign. He didn't like dealing with men like Marcus Vance, but he needed information, and in a place like this, credits only got you so far. Trust was a rare currency, one that often had to be taken rather than earned. A faint shuffle of boots on metal, someone approaching. Nathan stayed still, waiting. "I didn't think you'd actually come," came a low rasping voice. Nathan turned his head slightly, catching the silhouette of Marcus Vance, a former soldier now an information broker who thrived in the dirtiest corners of the galaxy. His face was a road map of old scars, and his left arm was cybernetic from the elbow down, whirring faintly as he adjusted his coat. "I don't have time for pleasantries," Nathan said, his voice cold. "Where is he?" Vance smirked, but his eyes were wary. "Straight to business, just like the stories say." He pulled a small device from his coat, tapping a holographic map into existence. Your father's not dead yet. The Cryans dragged him off-world. Their usual hideouts are too exposed after this mess. They're moving him to Tavros Station. Nathan's jaw tightened. A space station, that complicated things. But it also meant the Cryans weren't planning to kill his father immediately. They needed something from him, information, leverage. Either way, it bought Nathan a window. How do I get aboard? Vance let out a low chuckle. You don't. Not unless you have a death wish. Tavros locked tight. High clearance docks only, biometric entry, armed patrols everywhere. Go in loud, you won't make it 5 steps. Nathan stared at him, unblinking. Then I go in quiet. Vance's smirk faltered. Listen, kid, you might be some big shot SEAL, but even ghosts leave footprints. You don't have the clearance. You don't have a ship. He paused, then hesitated before adding, but I might know a guy. Nathan stepped closer, his presence suddenly suffocating. No games, Vance? You owe me. Vance swallowed hard, nodding. Fine. There's a smuggler. Goes by Dane Rower. Specializes in getting past locked doors. If anyone can get you aboard, it's him. Where? Vance hesitated, then sighed. Docking Bay 16, but he won't help for free. Nathan held Vance's gaze for a long moment before turning away. He won't have a choice. The meeting with Dane Rower was brief. The smuggler, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a perpetual smirk, tried to haggle. Nathan wasn't interested. A single application of leverage, a wrist twisted to the breaking point, a knife pressed just hard enough against his throat, made it clear that negotiations were unnecessary. You're insane, Rower spat, rubbing his wrist after Nathan finally released him. Nathan stared at him, expression unreadable. Can you get me in or not? Rower exhaled through clenched teeth. Yeah, but once we're on that station, you're on your own. That was fine. Nathan had always worked better alone. The journey to Tavros Station was uneventful, if tense. Rower's ship, the Seraph, was small enough to slip through Cryan patrols unnoticed. The moment they docked, Nathan moved fast. He had 3 objectives: locate his father, disable security measures, and eliminate anyone who stood in his way. He infiltrated the lower decks first, dispatching a lone guard with a swift, silent takedown. The Cryans might have been efficient killers, but they weren't expecting someone like him. He moved like a shadow, slipping past patrols, evading detection with the ease of a predator accustomed to hunting in enemy territory. Then he found the holding cells. His father was there, bruised but alive. The dim light cast deep shadows across his face, but his expression hardened when he saw Nathan. Figured you'd show up, Tom rasped. Took your damn time. Nathan didn't react to the quip. Can you walk? Tom exhaled, shifting his weight. I'll manage. Nathan pulled a small device from his belt, attaching it to the lock. A soft beep, and the door slid open. Then the alarm started. Nathan's grip tightened on his rifle. So much for quiet. Heavy boots pounded against the floor above, the unmistakable echo of approaching reinforcements. Tom groaned. You really don't do subtle, do you? Nathan handed him a sidearm. Stay close. The first wave of Cryan enforcers rushed in. Nathan moved before they could react, dropping low and firing 3 precise shots: head, throat, chest. Each target fell before their weapons could even be raised. Tom, despite his injuries, wasn't slow. He grabbed a fallen weapon, rolling behind cover and returning fire with practiced efficiency. But the Cryans weren't amateurs. More were coming. A lot more. Nathan assessed quickly. They needed to disrupt the station's security grid. If they stayed, they'd be overwhelmed. He spotted a terminal across the hall, glowing with power. Cover me, he ordered, moving fast. Tom didn't argue. He provided suppressing fire as Nathan hacked into the system, his fingers working rapidly across the console. Then he saw it. A tracker. They had known Nathan would come. The Cryans hadn't just been holding his father hostage, They had been waiting for him. A voice crackled over the station's comms, deep and laced with amusement. Nathan Lancaster. Nathan's blood ran cold. We've heard so much about you. The station shuddered. The docking bay doors sealed shut. Escape was no longer an option. Nathan exhaled slowly, then looked at his father. This just got complicated. Tom gave a dry, humorless chuckle. Complicated, son? This is just getting started. Nathan Lancaster tightened his grip on the pulse rifle, his gaze flicking between. The reinforced blast doors groaned under pressure as the shrieking alarms still howled through Tavro Station, a shrill promise of the battle yet to come. The Cryon Syndicate had been waiting for them, that much was clear, but they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had given Nathan a reason to fight. Tom Lancaster wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. His breathing still labored from the beatings he had endured. He was injured, but he wasn't broken. His eyes met Nathan's, and for the first time in years, the quiet understanding of shared weariness passed between them. They're closing in, Tom muttered, checking the charge on his stolen pistol. What's the play? Nathan didn't hesitate. We move fast. If we stay here, we're boxed in. His fingers danced over the terminal he had hacked moments earlier. He had managed to disrupt the station's external security grid, but internal lockdowns remained active. If they didn't get to the core command center and override the controls, they were going to die here. Heavy boots thundered in the corridor beyond the door, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of pulse rifles being primed. The Cryons were preparing for a breach. Nathan motioned for Tom to move toward cover, his mind working at a blistering pace, calculating angles, escape routes, potential weak points. Then the doors exploded inward. Smoke and shrapnel filled the air as armored enforcers poured in, their dark figures silhouetted against the flickering emergency lights. Nathan moved before they could gain a foothold, his rifle kicking against his shoulder as he fired precise, controlled bursts. First shot, head, second shot, throat, third, center mass. 3 bodies crumpled before the others even registered what had happened. But the Cryons weren't mindless thugs. They adjusted, taking defensive positions, their weapons spewing plasma fire that seared against the metallic walls. Tom ducked low, returning fire with deadly precision. Despite the bruises and cracked ribs, he still fought like a man who had lived through worse. Nathan grabbed a flash grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and tossed it forward. A burst of blinding white light filled the corridor. He didn't wait for the aftershock to fade. He was already moving. Sliding low, he drove the butt of his rifle into the nearest enforcer's gut, then twisted, bringing up his combat knife in a sharp, practiced arc. The blade sliced through soft tissue, severing an artery in the alien's neck. A gurgled gasp, then silence. Tom followed his son's lead, putting down the last attacker with a shot between the eyes. Then stillness. Both men stood in the aftermath of the short but brutal fight, their breathing heavy, the scent of scorched metal thick in the air. Nathan reloaded, barely sparing a glance at the bodies. More will be coming, he muttered. Tom let out a low, humorless chuckle. Yeah, I figured that part out. Nathan tapped into the station's schematics using the stolen terminal. Main security hub is 2 levels up. We take control, drop the lockdown, and get the hell out. Tom raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do we get up 2 levels with an entire syndicate trying to kill us? Nathan pulled a detonator from his belt and smirked. Loudly. They moved fast. Nathan placed explosives at key junction points, ensuring any Cryon reinforcements would have a hard time following. The concussive force of the blast echoed through the station, causing bulkheads to buckle and lights to flicker in protest. With calculated ruthlessness, Nathan cut down any stragglers in their path. Each movement was precise. Each kill efficient. Tom had always known his son was dangerous, but seeing him like this, a relentless force of nature, was something else entirely. They reached the stairwell leading to the command center. Nathan went first, his rifle raised, muscles coiled like a predator waiting to strike. The moment they reached the top, another wave of enforcers charged. Their rifles roared. Nathan dived behind a console, narrowly avoiding the barrage. He peeked out, analyzing their positioning. They were dug in, using the room's cover effectively. A straight fight would be costly. Tom pressed against the opposite wall, gritting his teeth. Ideas? Nathan scanned the layout. Then he spotted it, a coolant pipe running overhead. Shoot the pipe, he ordered. Tom didn't hesitate. His shot was perfect, rupturing the line and flooding the room with freezing vapor. The Cryans coughed, their movements sluggish as the sudden drop in temperature disrupted their thermal visors. Nathan took the opening. He moved with deadly precision, a blur of motion. His knife found flesh, his rifle spat death. One by one, the Cryans fell until only silence remained. Nathan approached the main console, fingers working quickly. The lockdown override required clearance codes. He didn't have time to brood. He forced them. Then he noticed something. A name flashed across the security logs: Vector. Nathan's blood turned to ice. Vector wasn't just a Cryan leader. He was their executioner. A warlord with a reputation so violent that even criminal syndicates spoke his name in whispers. Nathan's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was a trap set specifically for him. The realization hit hard, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He overrode the station's security, disengaging the lockdown and initiating an emergency evacuation protocol. Sirens blared as automated systems began shutting down non-essential power. Tom stood beside him, breathing heavily. "We done here?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "Not yet. We still have to get out. And if Vector is here, it means the worst is still ahead." As if on cue, the comms crackled. A deep, rumbling voice filled the room, dripping with amusement. "Nathan Lancaster." Nathan's spine stiffened. "You've made quite the mess." Vector's voice carried the weight of undeniable menace. "But it won't matter. You walked into my den, and now you die here." The station shuddered violently. Nathan's stomach dropped as he realized why. Vector wasn't just sealing their fates, he was destroying the entire station. The station trembled beneath their feet, a deep, guttural groan reverberating through the metal as alarms screamed in protest. Nathan barely needed to glance at the terminal to confirm what his instincts already knew: Vector had initiated the self-destruct sequence. The Cryan warlord was determined to erase. Every loose end was tied up, even if it meant sacrificing his own men. Smoke curled from the scorched consoles, flickering red emergency lights casting jagged shadows along the bulkheads. The distant rumble of explosions signaled the beginning of the station's death throes. "We need to move now," Nathan growled, shoving extra cartridges into his belt. Tom exhaled sharply, shaking off the lingering pain of his injuries. "I assume you have an exit plan?" "I'll make one," Nathan replied, not waiting for a response. He turned on his heel and sprinted toward the corridor leading to the docking bay, his rifle raised, breath measured. The pulse of combat still throbbed through his veins, but this was no longer about survival. It was about finishing it. They barely made it a dozen paces before the sound of heavy footfalls echoed ahead. The air seemed to darken with the presence of something larger, deadlier. Then he appeared. Vector stepped forward, his hulking frame casting a long, terrible shadow beneath the flickering emergency lights. His battle-worn exo-armor hummed with hidden power, the scarred armor adorned with the sigils of the Cryan Syndicate and countless vanquished foes. His crimson eyes locked onto Nathan with the cold amusement of a predator that had already claimed its prey. "You should have left when you had the chance." Vector's voice was thick with confidence, with certainty. "Now you die alongside this rotting husk of a station." Nathan didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and pulled the trigger. Vector moved with inhuman speed, shifting to the side as the plasma rounds grazed his armor but failed to slow him down. He surged forward like a living battering ram, his clawed gauntlet swinging in a vicious arc. Nathan barely managed to dodge, rolling to the side as metal screamed against metal where he had been standing just a second earlier. Tom fired twice, both shots hitting true, but Vector barely reacted. The energy dissipated against his personal shielding. With a snarl, the Cryan leader ripped a metal console from the wall and hurled it. Tom ducked just in time, the console obliterating the wall behind him. Nathan pivoted, closing the distance in a blink. He drove his combat knife forward, aiming for the seams in the armor, the weak points. But Vector anticipated it. He caught Nathan's wrist mid-strike, his grip like a steel vice. Pathetic. Before Nathan could react, Vector twisted and drove him backward. Nathan's body slammed into the bulkhead with bone-rattling force. The world flashed white with pain as oxygen rushed from his lungs. Tom fired again, trying to create an opening, but Vector was relentless. He rushed forward, slamming his massive forearm into Tom's gut, sending him sprawling. Nathan recovered fast, pain pushed aside by sheer instinct. He drew a flash charge from his belt, triggering the detonation mere feet from them. A blinding burst of light erupted, the concussive force rattling the corridor. Vector roared in frustration as his optics overloaded, staggering just slightly, just enough. Nathan lunged. His blade found flesh, burying deep into the gap between armor plates. Vector snarled, a sound like grinding stone, but Nathan didn't stop. He twisted the blade, driving it deeper until thick, dark Cryan blood splattered against the walls. Vector responded with raw fury. He grabbed Nathan by the throat and lifted him off the ground. His grip was crushing, like a vice. Nathan struggled, his vision darkening at the edges. Tom, still dazed, looked up. His son was seconds from being snapped in half. His gun was too far. His strength was failing. But he wasn't about to watch his boy die here. He reached into his boot and withdrew the small vibro knife he had carried for years, a weapon of last resort. Summoning everything left in him, Tom lunged, driving the blade into the exposed wound Nathan had created. Vector's body jerked, his grip loosening just enough. Nathan ripped free, gasping for air. He didn't waste a second. He snatched his fallen rifle from the floor, jammed it beneath Vector's chin, and pulled the trigger. The blast tore through flesh and bone, Vector's massive body convulsing before finally collapsing. The light in his predatory eyes faded to nothing. Silence. For a long moment, neither Nathan nor Tom moved. The station rumbled again, the destruction accelerating. Nathan, still catching his breath, looked down at the warlord's corpse, his grip on the rifle tight. Tom, leaning against the wall, coughed weakly. "Hell of a way to settle old grudges," Tom muttered. Nathan almost smirked, but there was no time to celebrate. They weren't out yet. Nathan hauled Tom to his feet, supporting him as they staggered toward the nearest emergency escape pods. The corridors were deteriorating, metal buckling, fires raging uncontrolled. The ship groaned, its very structure beginning to collapse. "Hold on," Nathan muttered as he punched in the pod's launch sequence. Tom sank into the seat beside him, breathing ragged but steady. The hatch sealed, the thrusters ignited, and the escape pod ejected just as Tavros Station collapsed in on itself, swallowed by fire and vacuum. Through the viewport, they watched the once mighty fortress of the Cryan Syndicate tear itself apart, debris scattering into the void. The warlord was dead. His empire crippled. Nathan exhaled, pressing his head back against the seat. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, not relief, not satisfaction, not closure. Tom glanced at his son. The weight of all that had passed lingered between them, a lifetime of distance, of words left unsaid. But in that moment, none of it mattered. "You saved my ass back there," Tom muttered. "Guess I owe you a drink." Nathan let out a slow breath, a flicker of amusement finally touching his expression. "I don't drink," he said. Tom smirked. "Fine, then you can buy me one." The escape pod drifted through the void, leaving the ruins of vengeance behind. There was no neat ending to stories like theirs, but for the first time in years, Nathan Lancaster wasn't just a soldier. He was a son.